All right, welcome to week 8 in our macroeconomics class. This week we are going to talk about growth, and specifically, before we actually start talking about growth, we're going to go through a couple methods to compare real GDP across countries. Once we understand those methods and how we can compare GDP per person across countries, we'll take a look at how it differs across the world and explain those differences across the world, looking at exponential economic growth. And then we'll model growth using something called the aggregate production function, a model of the overall economy. And then lastly, we'll talk about the aggregate production function and technology's effect on the aggregate production function. Okay. All right, so in this video, we're going to talk about the two different measures, or two different ways we can find, real GDP, real GDP per capita, income per person, income per capita. We need a conversion to be able to assess one country and when one country's currencies macroeconomic variables to another country's macroeconomic variables. So the two different ways we do this are through the exchange rate method and something called the purchasing power parity, the PPP, we'll call it, to make things easier. And so with the first method, with the exchange rate method, what you're doing is you're going to take the real GDP in the current in the economy that you're looking at, currency, and you're going to convert it using its exchange rate with the dollar. So for example, if we're trying to convert, which is what we're going to do, if we're trying to convert China's GDP measured in Chinese currency, measured in yen, well, we're going to have that in yen per person or per capita. So to convert that into dollars, we're going to need, importantly, we're going to need dollars over yen, the ratio of the exchange rate such that it's dollars over yen. Okay. And so when we do that, well, if we actually take some figures here, if China's GDP per capita is 43,686 yen per person, remember, per capita, that's the same thing as saying per person. Well, if the exchange rate is such that 1 yen will get you $0.161, get you 16 cents of a dollar. So 16 cents of a dollar is equal to 1 yen. That is the exchange rate. That is the rate at which dollars are converted to yen in 2015. Okay. So if we did that, well, then notice what you're doing is you're taking 43,686 yen per person and multiplying that by $0.161 per 1 yen. Okay? Which means that when we go through and actually calculate this, it means the yens are going to cancel out, and you're going to be left with something that's measured in dollars per person, which is what we want. We want to find the Chinese GDP per capita in US dollars, because then we can compare it to the US, and then we can compare it to whatever other currency we convert into dollars. In the other case, we'll convert Saudi Arabia's real GDP into dollars. So when we do this, what's our result? What's 43,686 times 0.161? Well, it's $7,033 per person. That is the real GDP in US dollars for the average Chinese citizen in 2015. Okay. We can do the same thing for Saudi Arabia. Here we have Saudi Arabia's currency in rial. And so the exchange rate is 1 rial will get you, it can be exchanged for $0.267 in US currency. So about 27 cents per rial was the exchange rate in 2015 for Saudi Arabia's currency. So if we do that, again, remember, we're taking, in this case, it's the rial per person, we'll just call it R per person, which is 80,317, and multiplying that by dollars per 1 rial. So in that case, the exchange rate was $0.267 per rial. So that ends up being 21,400. Let me get a different color here. 21,445, again, importantly, dollars per person. Okay. And again, the rials are going to cancel out when we do this multiplication. We're going to get dollars per person. Now we can compare, before we had, Chinese real GDP per person in yen, and for Saudi Arabia, we had it in rial. And now it's like, how do you compare these two? Well, they're in different currencies. You can't compare them. Now we can. Now they're in dollars per person. And we see that Saudi Arabia's, average income, GDP per capita is like your average income. It's like the average wealth available to the average person in a country. Well, now we see that the average person's real GDP per capita in Saudi Arabia is like 3 times as much as it is in China. Okay, but that's using the exchange rate method of calculating, of converting real GDPs and converting these statistics. Well, is that the best measure? Well, maybe not. And the reason it may not be the best measure is because it doesn't account for cost of living changes. Doesn't account, or I shouldn't say changes, doesn't account for differences in the cost of living prices, essentially, price, like the overall price level in, CPI or the GDP deflator. It doesn't account for differences in cost of living across countries. Okay. And so essentially what we're saying is, a country may have a relatively low real GDP per person, but because the cost of living is relatively lower, the price level is relatively lower in their economy, then, $1 there can seemingly buy more stuff than $1 in a wealthier economy like the US. Okay. Also, exchange rates fluctuate sometimes not because of changes in the cost of living in the home country. Sometimes exchange rates aren't going to be the best method for comparing real GDP and real GDP per person across countries. Rather, we have something called the purchasing power parity. And what that does is it uses a representative bundle of goods and the cost of that representative bundle of goods, and they compare what that cost is in one country to what that cost of the bundle of goods is in another country. So if we are looking at GDP per capita in dollars, well, we're going to, again, multiply the GDP per capita in the local currency by a ratio of dollars to the local currency. And that's the key. You want to have the local currencies cancel themselves out. So basically, we call this ratio between the cost of a representative basket of goods in dollars to the local currency, We call this a PPP adjustment, okay? And usually these basket or bundle of goods has many goods in it that represent the average buying habits of the average domestic consumer. But to keep things simple, and because Big Macs are so, global, the Big Mac estimation, where you compare the price of a Big Mac in one country to the price of the Big Mac in another country, ends up being a pretty good PPP adjustment. Okay, so let's take a look at that adjustment. Well, in the U.S. in 2015, the price of a Big Mac was $4.79. In China, it was 17.2 yen, and in Saudi Arabia, it was 11 rials. Well, again, maintaining that we're going to have dollars over yen as our conversion. So we're going to take the price in the US compared to the price of a Big Mac in China, and we're going to multiply that by what China's GDP per person is in their current currency or in the domestic currency to find what GDP per capita is going to be in dollars. Okay, so from before, GDP per capita was 43,686, again, yen per person. Now we're going to take the price of the Big Mac in dollars, which is $4.79, over the price of the Big Mac in China, 17.2 yen. Found here. You can't see it. Yen cancel out, and we are left with $12,000, about $12,000 for the average Chinese person. Where in Saudi Arabia, doing the same calculations, again, you're remembering dollars are going to go in the numerator of your PPP conversion, and the domestic currency is going to go in the denominator. So using the ratio of $4.79 to 11 rials, what do we get GDP per capita to be in Saudi Arabia in dollars? 34,000, about 35,000 dollars per person. Now notice that when we found real GDP per person using the PPP method, that real GDP per person in US dollars is actually higher than it was using the exchange rate. So US GDP in 2015 was about 51,000 per person. But because the cost of living is higher in the US, we see that using the exchange rate, Chinese people are relatively less wealthier compared to US citizens than they are compared using the PPP method. Again, that's because the cost of living is relatively higher in the US when compared to China and Saudi Arabia, right? Because we see the same thing in Saudi Arabia, where US citizens are seemingly wealthier using the exchange rate, but once we account for Saudi Arabian prices, we see that US citizens are a little bit less wealthier using the PPP method than using the exchange rate method. Again, because prices, the cost of living, the price level in China and Saudi Arabia are going to be relatively lower, meaning a dollar there is going to be able to buy a citizen more stuff than a dollar in the US. Okay. All right. That's it for this video. In the next video, we are going to take a look at comparing economic growth over time, and we'll move on to the aggregate production function after that.